People think that influence is celebrity. People think that influence is having a big platform that's measured by likes and follows. Real influence happens in real life, in real relationships, face to face, within families, within communities, at the workplace, wherever God has called and placed us. I don't think we need more Christian authorities or Christian thought leaders. What we need are Christians who can think like Christians in every aspect of culture, every aspect of life, living out where God has placed them in everyday, ordinary life, living out of this extraordinary story of hope. The Colson Center exists so that the church, that Christians can be the church in this particular cultural moment, living out where God has placed them in everyday, ordinary life, living out of this extraordinary story of hope.
Christian Worldview. I'm Bob Sprott. This was birthed 3 years ago, March. This was one of those 3 a.m. wake-up deals where you have this brainstorm and it won't go away. So I have a habit of I go and I write it down, and then you're like, okay, Lord, just put me to sleep. And then you look at that note in the morning and you say, you know what, I need to check this out. I was completing the Colson Fellows program at that time. This event was the result of becoming a Colson Fellow and trying to launch something new up here in our northern community. So we lost 2020 to COVID, no surprise. A lot of people lost a lot of things, including family members. Tonight, we want to explore a different subject. Each year, we've done something different. And tonight, we're going to explore the case for truth. And from our music to our speakers, you're going to hear from John Stonestreet here first. John is the president of the Colson Center in Colorado Springs. Brett Kunkle is in California. He runs a ministry called Maven Truth. And last but not least is Lee Strobel out of Houston with Lee Strobel Ministries. So you're going to learn from each of these men. Some of them were our teachers when we were going through the Colson Fellows program. And this is an opportunity to bring some of them to you, right here to our town in Petoskey. Interesting tidbit. I should have done this 3 years ago. I looked up symposium definition about 3 weeks ago. I was shocked that in Greco-Roman days, it was a drinking party. So I thought, oops, a little late. Fortunately, newer definitions say that it is an exchange of ideas. And I was grateful to read that, because, and it says usually 3 or more. So I got 3. So let's, I want to thank our donors. You've seen them scrolling by. This event takes cash to run, and we are just grateful to keep it a free event. We realize it makes it a little bit of a circus for seating. I apologize for that. But we like the idea of it being for any and everybody to walk in here. Other thing new tonight is we have about 3,000 of our best friends watching on live stream. So you see more cameras, more tech people than usual, because it's our first broadcast of this across the country. And we're grateful for that. I'd like to begin, let's kind of turn this into a sanctuary. I met a young couple, I don't know, well, I knew them before they knew me. I was that predator after church waiting to meet McKenna in the lobby, right? Come on out, McKenna. And I'm like, you know, hey, I've got something for you guys to do. This is Sam and McKenna Schubkakel. And you're awesome. She's awesome.
same God who makes the planet spin, tells the tide when it should rise, put the color in my eyes. The same God who makes the seasons change, knows the number of the stars, every secret in my heart, all my doubts, all my questions, and every fear I have about what might happen. You're the same God, you're with me in the middle of it all, God. You're catching every tear as it falls. I know you'll never change, even when I'm feeling far away. You love me the same, God. You love me the same. You're a God of grace and empathy. Even darkness is a lie, 'cause you lived a human life. You're not afraid of anything. Even darkness is a lie. There's no reason I should hide all my doubts, all my questions, and every fear I have about what might happen. You're the same God, you're with me in the middle of it all, God. You're catching every tear as it falls. I know you'll never change, even when I'm feeling far away. You love me the same, God. You love me the same. Catching every tear as it falls. I know you'll never change, even when I'm feeling far away. You love me the same, God. You love me the same, God. You love me the same, God. You love me the same. You love me the same. Letting go of every single dream, I lay each one down at your feet. Every moment of my wandering never changes what you see. I've tried to win this war, I confess. My hands are weary, I need your rest. Mighty warrior, king of the fight. No matter what I face, you're by my side. When you don't move the mountains, I'm needing you to move. When you don't could walk through. When you don't give the answers as I cry out to you, I will trust, I will trust, I will trust in you. I will trust in you. Truth is, you know what tomorrow brings. There's not a day ahead you have not seen. So in all things be my life and breath. I want what you want, Lord, and nothing less. When you don't move the mountains, I'm needing you to move. When you don't part the waters, I wish I could walk through. When you don't give the answers as I cry out to you, I will trust, I will trust, I will trust in you. I will trust in you. You are my strength and comfort. You are my steady hand. You are my firm foundation, the rock on which I stand. Your ways are always higher. Your plans are always good. There's not a place where I'll go you've not already stood. When you don't move the mountains, I'm needing you to move. When you don't part the waters, I wish I could walk through. When you don't give the answers as I cry out to you, I will trust, I will trust, I will trust in you. Yes, I will trust in you. I will trust in you.
Well, Bob asked me to sing, and I was like, I'll let take it from here. Wow, that was amazing. Hey, welcome back and for those of you that are here for the first time, to the Great Lakes Symposium on Christian Worldview. We love being up here as the Colson Center each and every year. I tell people all the time, Petoskey's kind of a well-kept secret around the rest of the country. And you probably don't want me to tell people, but I tell them. I'm like, look, this is the most beautiful place on the planet for like 3 whole months, right? And it really is great. So we love being up here, and we love the opportunity to share a little bit about how we can understand what's happening in our cultural moment from a Christian worldview. I also want to say welcome to everybody that's joining us online. I love the fact that we can do the live stream and have 3,000 other folks join us. This is really great. So in light of all that, I want to say thanks to Bob. Bob, thanks so much for all the work that you've done to put this together. Really, really fantastic, and no one pulls off a bow tie like Bob Spry. Is that true? Is that true? Absolutely fantastic. Well, look, we are going to walk through a conversation about truth, and throughout this evening, we want you to be able to participate and join the conversation in a new way, and that includes if you're watching online. And so you're going to have an opportunity as we go through. I'm going to speak for a little bit, then I'm going to bring up Brett, then I'm going to bring up Lee to speak for a little bit. And there's going to be questions. There's going to be things that you think about that you want to ask, especially from the brilliance of my talk. There's going to be so many questions. And if you wait until the end, you won't remember them. So here's the number right here that you can text. You can go ahead and write that down or take a screenshot of it like the kids do. and 719-257-7352. I think that number is also going to be on the live stream for you. And you can just text in your question at any point that it comes up during my talk, during Brett's talk, or during Lee's talk, and we will get to as many of them as possible near the end of the evening. Now, of course, that's completely dependent upon whether or not these guys stay on time, right? I never run over. Can't say the same thing for Brett. So we'll see how this goes. But if you want to text in a question, that'll make this a much more of a conversation. And the conversation we're going to have is a conversation about truth. The founder of our organization, Chuck Colson, was passionate about helping Christians understand not just that Christianity was true in the way that truth is often used. In our culture, we hear a lot about your truth and my truth. We hear a lot about, well, that might be true for you, but it's not true for... Now, here's the thing. If Christianity is true for you and not true for me, it's not true at all. Because Christianity, when we say it's true, and I can still hear Chuck's raspy voice saying, we need truth, we need to get back to truth. And one of his predecessors, Francis Schaeffer, would talk about true truth. The idea that Christianity isn't true for you if you believe it, it's true for you and everyone else, whether we believe it or not. Christianity is just flat out true. Now, the challenge, I'm talking about that sort of, the challenge of talking in that sort of way in our cultural moment isn't so much because people doubt the various truth claims of Christianity. Now, of course, some people do that maybe, well, I don't think the Bible's absolutely reliable, or I don't think Jesus actually rose from the dead, and I don't think, that there was such a thing as miracles. That was really the debate throughout much of the 20th century, the early 20th century precisely, is that are certain claims, or are the truth claims of Christianity actually true? Somewhere near the middle to end of the 20th century, this conversation dramatically shifted. It stopped being about whether the truth claims of Christianity are true, and it started to become whether there is such a thing as truth at all. Whether truth itself exists. Whether there actually are things that apply to all people at all times in the realm of morality or even history. And now we've reached a point where we not only doubt whether certain values or certain morals are true for everyone, we doubt whether even observable realities are true for everyone. So it's the very concept of truth itself that's up in the air. And not only that, but that's had an incredible wake across culture. That's left an incredible wake of destruction in so many aspects of our life and our world. And somebody predicted this. In fact, maybe the most accurate prediction about what the loss of truth would lead to in the 20th and now 21st century was given by a guy who was very prophetic. Now, he gets a really bad rap. Maybe it's because he said God is dead and he died of syphilis in an insane asylum. But other than that, there's this guy named Friedrich Nietzsche. How many of you guys have heard of Friedrich Nietzsche? Nietzsche, of course, is famous for saying God is dead. Now, it's very important to know, and he said that in a number of places. It's very important to know what he meant by that. He didn't mean that there was a God who then died. It wasn't a statement about the existence of God. It was a statement about the centrality of God in the Western world. And that the idea of God, the central reference point for so much of life in the world, had actually been replaced or had actually been removed. One of the places that he said this predicted in very profound ways what the death of God would lead to. It wasn't so much a statement that God is dead. It was a statement of, if God is dead, here are all the consequences that are going to happen from here on out. It's a fascinating piece, and I have been absolutely struck by it over and over and over the last about a year or so, as we've seen across culture what happens when a culture loses its tether from any fixed reference point. What we've seen, for example, when we give up
on ideas like loving one another and forgiving one another and seeing a common humanity in one another, when we give up on ideas that there is a common direction, one way to put it would be this: it's one thing to live in a cultural moment in which we agree on what we're trying to get to but disagree even vehemently about how to get there. It's another thing to live in a cultural moment where we don't even agree on what we're aiming at. Does that make sense? And the guy who predicted this in so many ways was Friedrich Nietzsche, in a remarkable work called The Parable of the Madman. Now, if you've never read that, you can Google it. Not while I'm talking, but you can Google The Parable of the Madman. It's not a very long read, but it's absolutely fascinating. It begins this way. There was a madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours. Now, why do you light a lantern if it's the bright morning hours? Well, because you're mad, or because you think everyone else is still in the dark. And he runs into the marketplace and he cries out, "I seek God, I seek God." Now, you have to understand, Nietzsche is writing this at the end of the 1800s. This is after the Enlightenment has largely questioned any sort of thing like revelation and the existence of God and the supernatural claims of Christianity. This was an age of atheism. This was an age of skepticism. This was an age of scientism, that scientific discovery and scientific advancement was going to solve all of our problems. There was a lot of what you might call utopianist in the European intellectual crowd. People who thought that because we had gotten the shackles of God and religion off our back, now we could move forward into an unfettered, progressive future where we can get rid of things like poverty and disease, and we can enter into a perfect society if we just scientifically engineer the human population and things like that. This is who Nietzsche is writing to. And he's talking about this madman jumping into the midst of the marketplace saying, "I seek God, I seek God." And Nietzsche said, well, there were many who were standing around just then who didn't believe in God, so they began to mock him. They began to say, well, is your God gone? Is he on a voyage? Is he using the bathroom? Is he asleep? And so they mocked him because, this is the end of the 1800s. No one believes in God in Europe anymore. And then the madman stares back at his mockers. And as Nietzsche puts it, he pierced them with his eyes. And he said, "Where is God? I'll tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers." And then what Nietzsche does through the mouth of the madman is he starts to walk through all the dramatic consequences that he thinks will inevitably happen because of removing God from a central reference point. Please silence your phones. Removing God as a central reference point to life and the world, both as individuals and as Western civilization. First of all, he says, this is a big deal. You see, he thought that many European intellectuals thought, well, hey, listen, moving past God is just going to be moving past God. Nietzsche realized that the entire world had been built in many ways around, as Christianity became the dominant force on the planet and the belief in God. Now, I'm not saying that folks who were religious or Christians or even in power always did this the right way. In many ways, they did all kinds of things wrong. But here's one of the things that Nietzsche says in the words of the madman. He said, how did we do this? How were we able to wipe away the entire horizon with a sponge? In other words, he's trying to help these guys realize it's a big deal to kill God. And then he says, how did we, and listen to this analogy, unchain the earth from its sun? One of the great findings of the scientific revolution, right, as Copernicus is looking at the stars, is that not that the sun revolves around the earth, but the earth revolves around the what? Sun. So what happens if the sun disappears one day? That's a bad day. And this is what he's saying. How did we unchain the earth from its sun? How did we do this? How did we pull this off? And then he goes into this analogy with the sun. He goes, if we've unchained the earth from its sun in the death of God, isn't the world going to become colder? Isn't the world going to become darker? How do we know what up and down is anymore? Are we not going up, sideways, all in one direction? How do we even know? And then there's this phrase. It's a remarkable phrase that he puts in it. And this is the one that keeps coming back to me, and here's why. Because over the last several years, as we've gone through this COVID pandemic and come out the backside, I'm absolutely convinced that COVID did not create nearly as many issues culturally as it revealed we already had. There are things called pre-existing conditions and for people, right? We know that as individuals, certain people with pre-existing conditions had higher morbidity rates when it came to being infected with the COVID virus. Now, just like there are individual or personal or health-related pre-existing conditions, what we have seen is that there are social pre-existing conditions. Ways in which our culture was dramatically broken, and COVID just shined a light on it. One of those things, and I'll just give you this as an analogy or as an example. In 2019, at the end of 2019, I did one of our Breakpoint commentaries. This is something we do every single day by email and podcast, where we look at a story that we see and try to bring an analysis from a Christian worldview. And what we saw was really shocking, is that 2019 was the third straight year where the mortality rate of American males went down. This had not happened for 3 straight years since, you ready? The end of the 2010s. Do you know what, the end of the 1910s. Do you know what was happening at the end of the 1910s? When the mortality rate, the death rate for American males went down 3 straight years? Do you know what was happening then? World War I and the Spanish flu. This was before COVID. 3 straight years. This is nearly 100 years, or more than 100 years, after, how many advancements medically had we made? How much more access did we have to hospitals? We knew all kinds more things about immunology and all kinds of different things. How on earth was it possible that in 2017, 18, and 19, that we had this trend that we had not seen for 100 years after all the medical advancement and all of that stuff? And it's because it had nothing to do with physical sickness. It had to do with an emotional brokenness that we were seeing as an epidemic across American culture. Suicide, addiction, overdoses. In fact, there's a name for it now. Deaths of despair. Here's the line from Nietzsche's The Parable of the Madman. If God is dead, he says, are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? See, there's a lot of people that just throw out that phrase all the time. The phrase of, well, there's not really any truth. There's no truth, there's only preference. It only matters what's true for you. What's true for you might not be what's true for me. And we say these things about truth as if that's an idea that has no consequences. One of the lines we like to say over and over and over at the Colson Center, and I know some of you here are Colson Fellows, so you've heard this line so many times you're probably tired of hearing it, but we're convinced that it's true. Ready? Ideas always have consequences. The bigger the ideas, the bigger the consequence. And an idea about truth will have huge consequences. And if it's a bad idea, it will have victims. The death of truth in the 20th century was what Nietzsche predicted. But he went on to predict not only, and by the way, he wasn't advocating for God. He didn't think that we should go back to belief. He thought the death of God was exactly the right thing. In fact, he predicted all kinds of other things. He predicted that contrary to what the utopianists predicted, that the 20th century, now that God was off our back, would be this kind of time of unfettered progress, that's not going to be the case at all. He predicted it would be among the bloodiest centuries in human history. Guess what was among the bloodiest centuries the bloodiest century in human history was the 20th century. He predicted that with the death of God, we were going to have the rise of the strongman, the Ubermensch, the Superman, the guy that would have to stand up and just decide what's true and what's right and the way things should be ordered. Can you think of anyone in the 20th century who might have had a Superman complex? In other words, Nietzsche kind of got it all right, except that God wasn't dead. But what he got right is if you untether reality from a fixed reference point, you untether reality from truth with a capital T. Not true for you and true for me, but truth. There is a sweeping set of consequences that follows. Here's how Nietzsche ended the parable of the madman. Nietzsche closed out by saying, he went on this rant, and it really is a brilliant rant. And then he kind of stops. And you know, if you've ever been in a conversation where you're talking at people and they're looking back at you like I have no idea what you're talking about, like some of you are doing just right now. The madman stops and he goes, you're not ready for this. I came too early, he said. The deed's been done, but deeds, even when they're done, require time to be seen and heard. This is still coming. This is still more distant. He said, this is more distant from them than the most distant stars, and yet they've committed the deed themselves. He predicted that the wake of this was still to come. I think, as we've seen a culture that seems to have no fixed reference point, a culture that has no clear idea of what's true, and not only what's true, but what's good and what's beautiful. I think what we're seeing now is that deed that Nietzsche talked about and the consequences that he predicted, that in many ways our culture is feeling the full brunt of those right now. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? And I think that the catastrophic loss of truth that he talked about 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, has led to other catastrophic losses that aren't just issues that we see on the coast, not just issues that we see in other parts of the world that don't have the same sort of freedom but the sort of issues that have become realities for so many of us in our own lives and in our own families. I'll sum it up this way. The catastrophic loss of truth has led to the catastrophic loss of other things. First, identity. When you lose the fixed reference point for reality, you lose the fixed reference point for what it means to be human. After all, what's true about us? Scripture says that every single person is made in the image of God. If we lose sight of God, we lose sight of ourselves and other people. Second, I think we have seen this. The catastrophic loss of truth has led to the catastrophic loss of identity and the catastrophic loss of love. We are an unforgiving, unloving society. The word love today doesn't even have a substance beyond an emotional feeling. And an emotional feeling, as many of us know, by the way, married couples, is the emotional feeling always there? Some of you are like, shh, she's right here. I know. That's not enough. Love is not a feeling. Love is something substantive, but it has to be oriented around that fixed reference point. You lose truth, you lose identity. You lose truth, you lose love. And finally, and this is what's behind the deaths of despair, you lose truth, you lose meaning. We are a culture that has dealt with a catastrophic loss of meaning. That's why we're having this conversation. That's why I'm so honored to be sharing the stage with my good friend Brett Kunkle and my good friend Lee Strobel to talk about this idea of truth. And many of you might say, well, truth, that's such a passé comment. We talk about truth and No. The loss of truth is underneath so much of the chaos that we see in our lives, so much of the chaos we see in our world, from individuals as well as entire societies, entire nations. And we need to understand what truth is. One of the big critiques about truth is that even if truth exists, we're too trapped in our own biases, and our own race, and our own gender, and our own cultural setting, and our own socioeconomic status, that we can't escape all of that sort of stuff to even access the truth. In other words, even if truth exists, who cares because it's not knowable? That's what Brett's going to deal with in just a second. And of course, Lee's got a story about going on a search for truth, in which he actually made a case for truth in his own heart and in his own mind, and it's radically transformed his life. So that's where this conversation is going. Does that make sense? You guys on board? Okay. Are you looking back at me like all the Mad Men's listeners? All right. Are we all good? Okay. Well, I'm really excited to invite my good friend Brett Kunkle to the stage. Brett is the founder and president of a wonderful organization that specifically provides resources for a lot of people, but specifically for parents trying to help ground their own kids in the truth. Do we need some help with that sort of? Do parents need that sort of help? Absolutely. So welcome Brett Kunkle to the stage.
Well, my role tonight is maybe a little different than Lee's and John's in that I'm kind of playing the role of a philosopher, which I'm glad to do because I took a 2-year graduate degree in philosophy and I crammed it into 10 years. That is difficult to do. And so all that effort, all that time, all that money, all that marital stress, Actually, no, my wife she was very supportive of that when I was doing that, but she would ask me the question constantly. She would say, honey, do you know what the difference is between a philosopher and the pizza delivery guy? And I would say, no, I have no clue. What's the difference? And she would look at me and say, the pizza delivery guy gets paid. And I don't know why she continued to ask me that question, but honey, if you're watching on the live stream, this moment is for you. Well, what John described is some of the events that have led us to the culture that we're in today, which can be described as a post-truth culture. We live in a post-truth culture. The Oxford English Dictionary defines post-truth in this way. It says, relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. This very thing is playing itself out in our culture. There's a young college student at my church in Southern California. Her name is Emily. She was recently hired as a manager at a jewelry store in Southern California. And she was really hired to clean up some of the mess that the prior manager had left and who had been fired. And so she was dealing with some employees who weren't very cooperative, and she eventually had to confront them. And one of these employees, an 18-year-old girl, was very upset and went off on her when she was confronted about some of the things that she was doing, gave her 2-week notice, and on the way out, made claims that Emily was racist. Okay. So Emily has to have a meeting with HR of this company. And they do an investigation. She has this meeting. Emily's this amazingly sweet girl, a woman of character. Well, so she's in this meeting with HR, and they're talking about these, the claims of racism against her. And at one point, Emily says to her, what's really important, though, in this conversation isn't just the perception, but what's really important is truth and reality. And I know that in reality, I was not a racist. I was not racist in this particular incident. The HR person looked at her and said, no, truth and reality don't matter. What matters is someone's feelings. So as John said, do ideas have consequences? Yes. Had consequences for Emily, who was subsequently let go from her job. And so this is why we need to think carefully about how we can know truth, because we live in a post-truth culture. And so what would give us, in this cultural context, what would give us any confidence that we can know the truth? Well, in the Christian worldview, we have the resources to help ground our knowledge of the truth. What grounds our knowledge of the truth? Genesis 1:26 and 27, right? Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. What gives us confidence that we can know the truth? What grounds our ability to know truth? It's the fact that we are creatures who are made in God's image. And part of that image is that we are rational beings. God is a rational God who's made us in his image, and so we are rational creatures. And those rational abilities that we have allow us to explore the world around us and to have confidence that we can know the truth. In fact, when you look at other potential ideas and worldviews to ground our ability to know truth, such as an evolutionary account, they fail. In fact, philosopher Alvin Plantinga has shown how evolutionary accounts actually undermine our confidence that we can know the truth, since the purpose of the evolutionary process is mere survival. And so, we can have confidence that we can understand the truth, know the truth, explore the world around us because we are made in the image of God. So, let's start with the definition of truth. Here's a basic definition of truth. This is what philosophers call the correspondence theory of truth. The correspondence theory of truth says that our ideas, our beliefs, our claims are true if they what? If they correspond to reality. Right, so philosophers call the idea or the belief or the statement, they call that the truth bearer. And when the truth bearer corresponds or matches up with reality, reality is the truth maker, then the statement is true. This is called the correspondence theory of truth. You know what I call this? Common sense. It's common sense, right? When our ideas are true if they match up with reality. Duh. And that's how we live our life. That's the common sense view, but just think about it. This is how powerful the culture is. The culture has knocked our common sense out of us, hasn't it? It's knocked our common sense out of us, and so now there's such skepticism about truth. And so when you deny an objective view of truth, well, you're in the mainstream. But just because you're in the mainstream of our culture doesn't mean it's the rational thing to do. In fact, I want to lay out two major problems with denying this view of truth, this common sense view of truth, that objective truth is that which corresponds to reality. Number one, when you deny truth, what you discover is that, sorry about that, when you deny truth, I don't know, this thing is just going crazy. Now it's just going to all the slides ahead of it. There we go. So, when you deny objective truth, here's what happens. Number one, denials of objective truth turn out to be irrational. Number two, denying objective truth turns out to be unlivable. Okay, let me cash this out for you. I want to give you an example, an illustration to help you understand this. Think about your sense perception, right? Sense perception, our five senses, is one of the ways that God has given us to understand and know the external world around us. Now, how do I know that this podium is in front of me right now? Well, I can use my sense of sight, right? And I can see the podium in front of me. And that sense of sight gives me knowledge of the external world. And it's just self-evident. I just take a quick look. No one has to convince me. No one has to give me a logical syllogism. I simply look and I see the podium, right? Now, imagine someone comes in here and they say, Brett, there's no podium up on the stage. If they were to give me a skeptical view of the existence of the podium, what would be my response? Would I look at them and go, oh my gosh, are you serious? Well, maybe I ought to be skeptical that there's really a podium. No, that's not my response. When someone says, no, Brett, there's no podium there, I don't go, oh, I don't start questioning the existence of the podium. Instead, what do? I question their ability to see the podium. I question their faculty of sight. I mean, say, is the lighting wrong in here? Are your eyes not working correctly? I mean, what's going on? And what would I say to convince them? I'd say, look again, right? Because it's just common sense that the podium is in front of us. We see it. And that sense perception gives us views, beliefs about the external world. So those beliefs are grounded in our sensory experience. Well, in the same way, our moral truth is grounded in our moral experience. So let me illustrate this by giving you a true-false test. Okay, here's the true-false test. All right, so you answer true or false. It is wrong to torture young children for the fun of it. Okay, it bothers me that there wasn't a little more emphatic response from this crowd. I don't know, maybe your moral equipment isn't working here. And let me just ask you to stay away from my children if you're going to, No, okay, it was just so obvious. That's what you didn't want to answer, right? So true or false, it's wrong to torture children for fun. The answer's true. Okay, how about this? True or false, killing innocent people for no reason is wrong. Okay, how about this one? Raping women is a moral good. False. We should practice racism daily. False. You should beat your siblings often for entertainment. Wait, you didn't answer that. No, okay, that one may be a little more controversial. Okay, so let's just set that one aside. Let's set that aside. But what we gave are examples of obvious moral truths. In fact, I want to restore your confidence that you can know moral truth. I want it should be at the same level that you have confidence that you're seeing this podium in front of you. That moral common sense has been knocked out of us by the culture. But think about one of our important founding documents. It actually appeals to this idea, right? The Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be what? Self-evident. That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So there are truths that are self-evident. Yes. And not just physical facts about the world, but the founders were referring to moral truths, rights, inalienable rights granted to us by God. And philosophers will refer to this ability to know moral truth as our moral intuitions. The equipment we're using here are our moral intuitions. An intuition is simply a reflective way of seeing something. It's a reflective way of seeing something. So you reflect for a moment and you just come to see the truth of it. Just like your sense perception of sight allows you to see the podium here, in the same way, our moral perception allows us to acknowledge moral truths. And guess what? You don't have to be a Christian to acknowledge these moral truths. This is a Kai Nielsen, an atheist philosopher, brilliant atheist philosopher. He wrote a book called Ethics Without God, and he's on the same page as us. This is what he says. He says, it is more reasonable to believe such elemental things like wife beating and child abuse to be evil than to believe any skeptical theory that tells us we cannot know or reasonably believe any of these things to be evil. I firmly believe that this is bedrock and right, and that anyone who does not believe it cannot have probed deeply enough into the grounds of his moral beliefs. So even the atheist can recognize the existence of moral truths. And guess what? This goes back to the image of God. Part of being made in the image of God is explained in Romans chapter 2 when Paul says that when Gentiles who do not have the law do instinctively the things of the law, these not having the law are a law to themselves, in that they show the work of the law written in their hearts. Right? God has written his moral law on our hearts, and we are able to apprehend moral truth. And it turns out that this is actually common sense. There is moral common sense. That is, there are things that are morally obvious. And this helps us to make the case that there are objective moral truths that we can know. And so what a denial of objective truth does, it's irrational because it causes us to deny that which is obvious, that which is self-evident, okay? And another way that it's irrational is that denials of objective truth turn out to be self-defeating, self-contradictory, right? And think about it. There are statements that we may make and we know they're false because they contain some kind of contradiction, right? So if I said to you, all English sentences are false. Okay, some of you missed that. All English sentences are false. That's an English sentence that's being asserted as true, but what's it claiming that all English sentences are false? Do you see the contradiction? Or if I said, no sentences are longer than 6 words. I see some of you counting. No sentences are longer than oh my gosh, that's 7, right? Or if I told you that all bachelors love their wives, right? Or my brother. Did you know that my poor brother is an only child? Okay, now maybe he wishes he was an only child, but if he's my brother, he's not an only child. You see the contradiction contained in each one of those claims. And of course, they get more sophisticated. People in our culture will say, hey, you shouldn't tell people that they're wrong. Is it wrong to tell people that they're wrong, right? You see the contradiction. Or how about this? I don't believe anything unless it can be proven scientifically. So here's the question. Is that a belief? I don't believe anything unless it can be proven scientifically. That's a belief. So how did you prove that belief scientifically? right? I mean, did you write it down on a piece of paper and heat it up in a beaker or something? I mean, how does that even work? Right? No, that's actually not a scientific claim. That's a claim of philosophy. And you see, it's self-defeating. And so when someone says there is no truth, the question is that true? All truth is relative. Is that truth relative? Well, okay, well, maybe truth is just unknowable. How do you know that? Right? Well, nobody has the truth. Well, that seems to be a truth that you know, right? And of course, it gets more sophisticated. We use different language. You say, well, actually, okay, all truth turns out to be a social construct. Right? All truth is a social construct. Do you still see the irrationality of that claim, the self-contradiction? Is the idea that all truth is a social construct itself a social construct, meaning it's merely an invention of society? And so these denials of objective truth are irrational. They collapse upon themselves. But then here's the second thing. Denying objective truth is unlivable. And so let's just take the idea that truth is a social construct. How about the truth of gravity? Is that merely an invention of society? And if we deny that, if there's a culture out there that doesn't have the concept or denies the concept, that they can therefore get up on their roofs and jump off and they won't fall to the ground? Right? Can you actually live that view out consistently? Think about in kind of popular culture, how does this get expressed? People will say, as John acknowledged, well, you have your truth. That's just your truth. And I've got my truth. When people ask me, or people respond to different claims, they say, Brett, that's just your truth. I have a question for them. Here's my question. Tell me, what does my dad look like? And I want to illustrate for them the unlivability of this claim. What does my dad look like? In fact, I want everyone, we don't have time to get some volunteers, but here's what I want you to do. Everyone in here, to kind of get an image of what you think my dad looks like. Get it in your mind right now. Think about how tall you think he is. Get a specific height. What color hair do you think my dad has? Right? How much do you think my dad weighs? Be careful. Okay. Okay, now you've got that image in your mind. Now, how would we know whether or not your description is true or not? Now, and think about it. If you said, oh, Brett, you know what? I think your dad is, 5'11", he's got dark hair, and, he's 195 pounds or something like that. If I looked at you and said, oh, that's interesting. That's your truth about my dad. And someone else gave another description, I said, oh, that's your truth about my dad. Would that be odd? Absolutely, that would be odd. We'd say, well, it doesn't seem to make sense. Can each individual who's got a different description of my dad have their own truth about my dad? No, we would take that description and we would do what? Match it up with reality. Does your description correspond to reality? So, does everyone have an idea of what you think my dad looks like? Okay, let's match it up with reality. Let me show you a picture of my dad. Here is my dad, Gary Kunkle. Okay, there he is. Why are you laughing? Can I see a picture of your dad so I can laugh at him? Okay, now, so this is my dad. So how did your picture match up with this? You thought his hair would be shorter. Wait. Some of you are looking at me with deep skepticism. Are you skeptical? How many of you in here would say, no, that's not your dad, Brett? Anyone here skeptical that this is my dad? Raise your hand. Okay, so a lot of people in here would say, no, okay, yeah, I don't believe that's your dad. Now notice, there's a difference between your belief and the reality, right? Now, if in truth this is my dad, right, then that's objectively true whether you believe it or not, whether I can prove it to you or not. Now, I may want to prove it to you, so I may show you more evidence. You need more evidence to come to the belief that this is my dad. So let me give you more evidence. I forgot to tell you, I forgot to tell you that my dad is a professional Santa. And so he used to work at the mall, and every year, my wife and I would take our kids to the mall and take pictures with Grandpa because that was their dad, right? Or that was their grandpa, and he would get us free pictures at the mall, right? Now, who's still skeptical? Raise your hand if you're still skeptical. Like, no, that's not enough evidence. It could be any Santa at the mall. So I would have to show you more evidence. I might say, well, here's a picture of my dad in our living room. Here's Grandpa with the kids. My dad grew up in Pittsburgh. He's a huge Steeler fan, right? He's a competitive guy. Got him on the racetrack. Own Santa. Here's another picture of my father right here. Look, he's got the t-shirt, right? I am your father. Now, I've given you more evidence. Who's still skeptical? Raise your hand if you're still skeptical. Be honest. Okay, so there's still skeptics here, right, who apparently don't believe in truth. We welcome you. Now, folks, look. I mean, I've given you some evidence here. Either this is my dad or I have a real creepy relationship with the mall Santa, okay? Hanging out with it. All right, so those of you who need one last bit of evidence, I'll give you one final bit of evidence. Here it is. Because I get it. You look at me and you look at this guy, you're like, how in the world is that your dad? Well, let me show you a picture of me, my wife, my mom, and my dad. And I'm going to give you a mathematical equation that will prove once and for all that this is my dad. Here's what happened. You take Santa, you put him with a short Vietnamese woman, and you get me, okay? That's how that works. Oh, you can applaud for that process. Now, what was the point of that? Okay? Here's the point. When I ask the question, what does my dad look like? And someone gives a description, we would never respond, well, that's just your truth. Why? Because the description about my dad is a claim about the objective nature of reality. And if I said, oh, that's your truth, and that's your truth, and that's my truth, we can't live that way. We would never affirm that everyone has their own truth about my dad. My dad can't be 5'9" and 5'11" and 6'2" at the same time, right? And so now this is maybe a humorous example of that, but just take that view, that you have your truth and I have my truth, take that to the bank and ask for your balance. And when they give you your balance, tell them you want to withdraw 10 times that amount. And when they look at you with questions, say, hey, you have your truth, I've got mine. Right? Or if you get in trouble with your spouse, look at him or her and say, well, you've got your truth, I've got mine. Okay, don't do that. That will not work out well. But here's the point. These relativistic subjective views of truth cannot be lived out. The denial of truth cannot be lived out because we live in a God-bathed world. And as John said, ideas have consequences. Why do we care so much about truth? Why do we just spend 20 minutes thinking about how we can know truth? Why do we care so much about truth? Because we know truth is connected to the good. We actually should care about truth because we love this culture and we love our neighbor. And when you deny truth, when your beliefs are false, you will run straight into reality, and it will bring harm into your life. The French philosopher Pascal said it this way. He said, men despise religion. They hate it and are afraid it may be true. The cure for this is first to show that religion is not contrary to reason, but worthy of reverence and respect. That's what we've tried to do in this last 20 minutes. But then he goes on to say this. Next, make it attractive. Make good men wish it were true, and then show that it is. Worthy of reverence because it really understands human nature. Attractive because it promises true good. That's why we care about the truth. Because we can love our neighbor and love this world and love our culture with the truth. And so we can never compromise on the truth.
Proud to welcome my friend Lee Strobel to the stage. You know Lee. Lee's the only one on the stage that has had a movie made about his life. All right? He's got a wonderful story of coming to Jesus. Would you welcome Lee Strobel?
Thanks, Sean. Appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thanks. I was going to start out and say how happy I am and pleased to be here in this beautiful community, but I got to be totally honest with you. I'm glad to be anywhere after what happened to me in Little Rock, Arkansas. I went to Little Rock to speak at a charity event, and this pastor picked me up from the airport. And we're driving to the event, we're chatting along the way. He said, yeah, he said, I told a young woman in our church, I said, Lee Strobel's going to speak tonight. She said, oh, the guy who wrote The Case for Christ? Is he still living? So I'm glad to be alive. I'm glad to be anywhere. But especially here in Bay Harbor. This is an awesome place. We ought to keep it secret, I think. Yeah, we ought not to be talking about it. I love those talks that Brett and John did because they give us a great foundation on truth. And what I want to do is kind of take that now and apply it specifically to Christianity and the Christian worldview. Because the Bible says that Jesus embodies truth. In John 1, verse 14, it says, Jesus came into this world full of grace and truth. Jesus himself said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. And so, in a unique way, Jesus is the ultimate reality because he is the unique Son of God. But how do we know that's true? What evidence do we have that that is reality? That's what I want to talk about, because if we don't have good reason to believe that, then the whole Christian worldview crumbles. Well, to answer that question of do we have any evidence to persuade us that Jesus is the ultimate truth, I want to tell you a story. It's a true story. It's my story. And it's a story that began in atheism. Because I decided at a rather young age that God does not and cannot exist. I mean, I just thought the mere concept of an all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful creator of the universe, come on, it's crazy. Wasn't even worth my time to check out. I thought this idea of Jesus being the Son of God, come on, that's mythology, that's legend, that's make-believe, that's wishful thinking. That's what I thought. Now, granted, I tend to be a skeptical person. My background's in journalism and law. Can you imagine put those two things together? What kind of a what kind of a skeptic that you get? I was legal editor of the Chicago Tribune newspaper, and we used to pride ourselves on our skepticism. We wouldn't accept anybody's word at face value. We always tried to get at least two sources to confirm a fact before we'd print it in the newspaper. So no kidding, we had a sign in our newsroom that said, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. Maybe she's lying. Got any evidence that that is true? Do you have any? And that's okay. You want journalists to be skeptical, right? Don't you wish sometimes they were more skeptical than they are? My problem was my skepticism bubbled over into cynicism, and it cemented me into my atheism. Now, because I had no belief in God, I really lacked a moral framework for my life. Now, I'm not saying all atheists are like this. I'm just saying I tend to be logical. I tend to be rational. And so, okay, if there is no God, if there is no heaven, if there is no hell, if there is no judgment, if there is no ultimate accountability, then the most logical way for me to live my life, I figured, would be as a hedonist, someone who just pursued pleasure. And that's what I did. And so I lived a very immoral and drunken and profane and narcissistic life, self-destructive in many ways. That was my life. What people saw was me winning awards for investigative reporting. What they didn't see was the other side, which was me literally drunk in the snow in an alley on Saturday night. There's so much rage inside of me. If you asked me back then, what's the deal? Why the anger? I couldn't have told you, but looking back, I could see what it was. I was always after the perfect high. You know, I was always after that ultimate experience of pleasure. But guess what? Everything let me down. Nothing lived up to the hype. It's a lot of rage. I remember once my wife and I got in an argument, and our little daughter was there, and I had so much rage, I just blew up. And I remember I reared back, and I kicked a hole right through our living room wall. And my wife's crying, and our daughter's crying. It's like, hey, that's just another day in the Strobel house. In fact, I'll tell you the ugliest thing about me, which was when my little daughter, Allison, was just a toddler. If she was alone in the living room, playing with some blocks or toys or whatever, and she would hear me come home from work through the front door, her natural reaction was just to gather her toys and go in her room and shut the door. Is she going to be drunk again? Is she going to be yelling and screaming and kicking holes in walls? You know what? At least it's nice and quiet in here. Friends, that's the ugliest truth about me. My wife was agnostic, I would call her, didn't know how to put spiritual stuff together. And if you saw the movie they did on us, you know that she met a Christian who was a nurse, and this woman shared Jesus with her, took her to church with her. My wife asked all kinds of questions, and then one day she came and she gave me the worst news an atheist husband could get. She said, "I've decided to become a follower of Jesus Christ." And I thought, oh no, here it comes. She's going to turn into some holy roller or something. First word that went through my mind was divorce. But I decided to stick around because I thought, you know what? What if I rescued her from this cult that she's gotten involved in? What if I were able to disprove the resurrection of Jesus Christ? Then even I, as an atheist, recognize that all of Christianity would crumble. Why? Because Jesus, in a variety of different ways, made transcendent and messianic and divine claims about himself. He claimed to be the Son of God. At one point, he got up before a group and he says, "I and the Father are one." And the Greek word there for one there is not masculine, it's neuter, which means Jesus was not saying I and the Father are the same person. He was saying I and the Father are the same thing. We're one in nature. We're one in essence. And how did the audience understand what he was saying? They picked up stones to kill him because they said, you're just a man and you're claiming to be God. So Jesus claimed to be God, but so what? I could claim to be God. Brett could claim to be God. John could, maybe not Bob. Not with the bow tie. I don't think God would have a bow tie. But anybody can claim to be God. But if Jesus claimed to be God, died, and then 3 days later rose from the dead, that's pretty good evidence that he's telling what? The truth. And so I launched on what turned out to be a nearly 2-year investigation focused on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And I want to just hit some of the highlights because I want you to walk away with something very practical. I want you to walk away with 4 words that begin with the letter E that summarize the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, keep in mind, when I did this investigation, I was a skeptic. I did not give the Bible any special credence. I could only accept it, not as the Word of God, not as inerrant and inspired. I believe it is now, but back then, I was a skeptic. But I had to accept it for what it undeniably is, which is a set of ancient historical writings. And I knew, just as you can investigate any ancient writing, whether it's by Suetonius or Tacitus or Josephus, you can take those same investigative techniques and apply them to the pages of the New Testament to try to determine, is it telling me the truth? And so, how do we determine the truth of what Jesus, what is the historical data? 4 words that begin with the letter E. First E stands for the word execution. You have to have a death first, right? Before you can have a resurrection. Well, when I investigated the death of Jesus, I found out very quickly there's no dispute among scholars about whether Jesus was truly dead after being crucified. In fact, no less of a source than the Journal of the American Medical Association, a secular, scientific, peer-reviewed medical journal, carried an investigation into the death of Jesus, and this was the conclusion, quote, "Clearly, the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead even before the wound to his side was inflicted." That's the Journal of the American Medical Association. Scholars don't doubt the death of Jesus. Why? Because when we study ancient history and we're trying to determine the truth of what took place, we're lucky if we have 1 or maybe 2 sources to confirm a fact. And yet, for the death of Jesus, we not only have multiple first-century accounts in the documents in the New Testament, we've got 5 ancient sources outside the Bible confirming and corroborating his death. We have Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian who worked for the Romans, Tacitus, another early historian, Mirabar Serapion, Lucian. Even the Jewish Talmud concedes the death of Jesus. In fact, you could go to one of the biggest atheist historians, Gerd Ludemann, formerly of Vanderbilt University, and he'll tell you this, quote, "Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable." I don't know how much you study ancient history, but there are very few facts of ancient history that a skeptical, critical, atheist historian would say is indisputable. One of them is the death of Jesus on the cross. The first E is for execution. Jesus was dead. The second E stands for the word early. We have early reports that Jesus rose from the dead. In other words, reports that go virtually back to the cross itself. Why is that important? Because I used to think, like a lot of skeptics, that the resurrection was a legend. And I knew it took time for legend to develop in the ancient world, so I figured 100, 150, 200 years after the life of Jesus, legends were invented, mythologies were spun, and that's where the idea of the resurrection came from. But what I learned, I think, decimates the claim that the resurrection is merely a legend. Follow me on this. I think this is fascinating. We have preserved for us a creed of the earliest Christians, a statement of conviction based on eyewitness accounts that the earliest Christians rallied around based on facts that they knew to be true. This creed says Jesus died. Why? For our sins. He was buried. On the third day, he rose from the dead, and then it mentions specific names of eyewitnesses and groups of eyewitnesses to whom he appeared, including 500 people at the same time. Now, what's important about this eyewitness-based creed of the early church is how immediately it developed after the death of Jesus. Remember I said it took time for legend to develop? Well, we can date this creed. How? Because the Apostle Paul preserved it for us in a letter he wrote to the church in Corinth. We call it 1 Corinthians. And if you go to 1 Corinthians 15, starting at verse 3, he reiterates this creed. Now, we know that Paul wrote that letter about 21 to 23 years after the death of Jesus. And he indicates in that passage he'd already given them this creed on an earlier visit. He's just reminding them. And so we can date that creed safely to within 20 years of the death of Jesus. Now, we could stop there, and that's very impressive historically. When you consider the first two biographies of Alexander the Great by Arrian and Plutarch were written 400 years after his life, and they're generally considered reliable. But here we have within 20 years, that's pretty good, but we can go back a lot earlier than that. How? Well, as the resurrection scholar Gary Habermas has pointed out, we know that Paul, the Apostle Paul, used to be Saul of Tarsus, a persecutor, a hater of Christians. 1 to 3 years after the death of Jesus, he's on the road to Damascus. Boom, he has this encounter with the risen Christ. He becomes the Apostle Paul. The first thing he does, he goes into Damascus and meets with some apostles. Many scholars believe this is when he was given the creed that he later includes in his letter to the church in Corinth. Others are a little more skeptical. They say maybe it was 3 years later. 3 years later, Paul goes to Jerusalem and he meets for 15 days with two eyewitnesses to the resurrected Jesus who are named in the creed, Peter and James. Be logical, they might mention this kind of stuff, right? In fact, the Greek word that Paul uses to describe this meeting suggests this was an investigative meeting. They're checking each other out. What do you know? What did you see? What did you experience? They're checking each other out. Some scholars say this is when he was probably given the creed by two people named in the creed. But either way, this means within 1 to 6 years after the death of Jesus, this creed is already in existence, and therefore the beliefs that make up that creed go back even earlier, virtually to the cross itself. In fact, one of the greatest historians in this area, James D.G. Dunn, wrote this. He said, this tradition by which he meant this creed, this tradition, we can be entirely confident was formulated as a creed, as tradition, within months of the death of Jesus. Within months. This is a news flash from ancient history. We don't have some big time gap between the death of Jesus and the later development of a legend that he rose from the dead. We got a news flash that goes right back to the beginning. In fact, one of the greatest historians who ever lived was A.N. Sherwin White of Oxford and Cambridge. He studied the rate at which legend developed in the ancient world. And he concluded that the passage of 2 generations of time is not even enough for legend to grow up and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. Well, we don't have 2 generations of time passing here. We got a news flash goes right back to the beginning. And that's not the only early report we've got. We've got others in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the book of Acts, all of which date back so early. They were circulating during the lifetimes of Jesus' contemporaries who would have been all too happy to point out the errors if they were making this stuff up. Friends, we got an execution. Jesus was dead. We have reports of his resurrection that are so early, so immediate, I don't think you can write him off as being a legend. But that's not all we've got. We've got a third word that begins with the letter E, which is the word empty. We have an empty tomb. The historical record tells us that Jesus' body was placed in a tomb belonging to Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish council. It was sealed. Matthew tells us it's guarded, and yet it's discovered empty that first Easter morning. Now, we could talk all night about all the lines of evidence that tell us that the tomb was empty, but I'm just going to give you one fact, because to me this is conclusive, and that's this. Even the enemies of Jesus admitted the tomb was empty. How do we know? Because when the disciples began proclaiming that Jesus had risen, what the enemies of Jesus never said was, oh, baloney, go open the tomb, you'll find the body. They never said that. We know from sources inside and outside the New Testament that when the disciples began proclaiming that Jesus had risen, what the enemies of Jesus said was, oh, well, the disciples stole the body. Think about that. What is it? That's a cover story. They're implicitly conceding the tomb is empty. They're trying to explain how it got empty. See what I'm saying? It's like if you're a teacher and a student comes up to you and says, the dog ate my homework. That student's admitting, I don't have my homework, but I can explain what happened to it. The dog ate it. It's the same thing. Everybody was conceding in the first century that the tomb was empty, either explicitly or implicitly. That's not the issue. The issue of history really is, how did it get empty? And we can go through the usual list of suspects. Romans weren't about to steal the body. They wanted Jesus dead. Jewish leaders of the day weren't about to steal the body. They wanted Jesus to stay dead. Disciples weren't about to steal the body. They didn't have the motive, they didn't have the means, and they didn't have the opportunity. In fact, we have 7 ancient sources, 6 of them outside the Bible, that confirm that the disciples lived lives of deprivation and suffering as a result of their proclamation that Jesus had risen. Why were they willing to do that? Why were they willing to die for it? Now, how some of them did die gets a little murky in history. That's not the point. Their willingness to die is confirmed by multiple sources, even outside the Bible. Why were they willing to do that? Because they heard on CNN that Jesus had risen? No. Because they read a blog that said, no. They were there. They touched him. They talked with him. They ate with him. Of all human beings who've ever lived in history, they knew the truth. They knew whether it was a lie or whether it was reality. And knowing it was true, they were willing to die for it. How did they know it was true? That brings us to the fourth word that begins with the letter E, which is the word eyewitnesses. Not only was Jesus' tomb discovered empty, but over a period of time, Jesus appears alive in a dozen different instances to more than 515 people, to men, to women, to doubters, to believers, indoors, outdoors, daytime, nighttime. As I said, the disciples talked to him and ate with them and touched him. Remember I said earlier, we're lucky when we study ancient history if we have 1 or 2 sources to confirm a fact. Well, get this. For the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus, we have no fewer than 9 ancient sources, inside and outside the New Testament, confirming and corroborating the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the risen Christ. Friends, that is an avalanche of historical data. I spent 2 years of my life investigating this kind of evidence, and it all came down to a Sunday afternoon. And I said to myself, you know, a good juror reaches a verdict. The evidence is in. I need to reach a verdict. And so I sat down with all of the evidence I'd accumulated over 2 years, documents and books and records, all this stuff, piles of stuff. And I started just reviewing it all. And then I stepped back and said, wait a second. In light of this avalanche of evidence that points so powerfully to the truth of the resurrection, I realized it would take more faith to maintain my atheism than to become a Christian. The scales just went like that. And that's when I reached my verdict in the case for Christ, that based on the historical data, I was convinced, and I was surprised by what I found, the truth, that Jesus didn't just claim to be the Son of God, he backed up that claim by returning from the dead. And then I thought, am I done? Is that it? I just go on with life as normal? Well, wait a minute. My wife pointed out a verse to me, John 1:12. It says, but as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believed in his name. And I noticed that the key words to that verse form an equation of what it means to become a child of God. Believe plus receive equals become. So, okay, I get it now. I believe based on the data that Jesus is the unique Son of God. He proved it by returning from the dead. I believe, but that's not enough. I had to receive. Receive what? Receive this free gift of forgiveness and eternal life that Jesus purchased for me on the cross when he died as my substitute to pay for all of my sin. And when I would receive this free gift of his grace in a prayer of repentance and faith, I would become a child of God. And so I got on my knees and I poured out a confession of a lifetime of immorality that would absolutely curl your hair. And at that moment, I received complete and total forgiveness through Jesus Christ, and I became a child of God. And my wife, Leslie burst into tears, and she threw her arms around my neck, and she said, I almost gave up on you 1,000 times. She said, when I was a new Christian, I met some women at church, and I told them about you. And I said, I don't have any hope for my husband. He is the hard-headed, hard-hearted legal editor of the Chicago Tribune. He is never going to bend his knee to Jesus. And this one elderly saint named Sylvia put her arm around Leslie's shoulder, kind of pulled her off to the side and said, oh, Leslie, no one is beyond hope. And she gave her a verse from the Old Testament, Ezekiel 36:26. It says, moreover, I will give you a new heart, and I will put a new spirit within you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And what I never knew at the time, this whole 2 years that I'm on this investigative journey, what I never knew is every day my wife, on her own, on her knees, in private, was praying that verse for me. And can I tell you what happened? Starting on that Sunday afternoon, now that I had received this free gift of God's grace, now that I had been adopted as a child of God, and then over time, as I was baptized, as I became part of a vibrant congregation of Christians, as I learned to read the Bible with fresh eyes, as I learned to worship, as I learned to pray, God began to answer her prayers because my values changed, and my character changed, and my morality changed. And my worldview changed, and my philosophy changed, and my attitudes, and my priorities, and my parenting, and my marriage. I mean, all these things over time began to change for the good. So much so that my little daughter, Allison, think about this. Here's a little kid. She was just 5 years old when I came to faith. All she knew the first 5 years of her life was a dad who was absent, angry, kicking holes in walls, coming home drunk. That was her whole life, first 5 years of her life. But starting on that Sunday afternoon, you know what she did? She started to watch. Something's changing with my dad. Something's different with my dad. Something's new with my dad. Never interviewed a scholar, never studied archaeology. She's just 5 years old, but she could watch, she could listen, she could observe, and she did. And it took about 4 or 5 months. And then one Sunday, she came up first to her Sunday school teacher and then to my wife, Leslie. You know what she said? I want God to do for me what he's done for Daddy. And at age 5, she received this free gift of God's grace. She became a child of God. And today she's married to a seminary graduate. She is the author of half a dozen novels. She writes fiction, but it all has the message of Jesus woven into that story. She's the mother of 2 of my 4 precious grandchildren. And today we're the best of friends. And same thing with my son. My son came to faith at a young age too because he saw the difference that God was making in his sister, in his mom, and his dad. So he comes to faith at a young age. He takes a different approach. He took an academic approach. So he went off and got an undergraduate degree in biblical studies. Then he got a master's degree in philosophy of religion. Then he got another master's degree in New Testament. And then after many years of study at Yale University and at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, he was awarded his PhD in theology. And you know what he does today? He's a professor of theology at one of the largest Christian seminaries in America, teaching future pastors about Jesus Christ. And 9 years ago, his wife gave birth to our first grandson. and they named him after me. Friends, God rescued our family. He changed my son. He changed my daughter. He changed my wife. He changed me. And now, a week from tomorrow, Leslie and I will celebrate our 50th wedding anniversary together. So that's my story. That's my story. What do you take away from that? I jotted down a couple of things, just a couple implications. If this evidence is true, if it does point to the reality of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, what are the implications for our worldview? What does that mean for us? And I thought, well, if Jesus is the unique Son of God, he proved it by rising from the dead. If he embodies truth, and if indeed he is the ultimate reality, then these implications are obvious. First, his teachings are more than just good suggestions from a wise teacher. They are divine insights that we can confidently build our life on. Second, if Jesus sets the standard for morality, then we have an unwavering foundation for our choices and our decisions rather than basing them on the ever-shifting sands of expediency and self-centeredness. If Jesus rose from the dead, he's still alive today, and he is available for us to encounter in a personal way. If Jesus conquered death, then he can open the door to heaven for you. If Jesus has divine powers, then he has the supernatural ability to guide us and help us and transform us as we follow him. If Jesus personally knows the pain of loss and suffering, then he can comfort us and encourage us in the midst of the turbulence that he himself warned is going to come into our lives because we live in a sin-stained world. If Jesus loves us, as he says he does, then he only has our best interests at heart. That means that we have nothing to lose and everything to gain by committing ourselves to him and his purposes. And finally, if Jesus is who he claimed to be, then as our creator, he rightly deserves our allegiance and our obedience and our worship. He is the ultimate truth. He does embody truth, and he can change our lives as a result. God bless.
All right, if you saw me looking at my phone while Lee and Brett were talking, it wasn't because I was texting. I was checking stock prices. But no, we've already got so many great questions that are coming in. It's fantastic. Please, I think we can put the number back up here on the screen and send it to the folks that are watching on live stream. We want to take as many questions as we can get to. And Lee, I just want to start with you here, and we've got so many great questions that have come in. Yeah. I was really struck there at the end about just embracing truth and the wake that it had in your life. Yeah. I started by making the argument that rejecting truth has an incredible wake in a person's life and in a culture. Do you have any hope whatsoever for our culture re-embracing truth and kind of things being reordered in any sort of real sense, like we see in your individual life? Because a lot of us just kind of look at the culture and it's like, man, things are lost. And you see the question?
There are a lot of bad trend lines. The percentage of young people who believe in God has dropped 10 percentage points in just 5 years. 71% of people used to be fully confident in the church as an institution. That's down to 31%. One of the most frightening statistics is that 35 million young people raised in Christian families will walk away from their faith before the year 2050. That's our kids, that's our grandkids, our great-grandkids. So there's a lot of dangerous trend lines. The other dangerous trend line is it takes 86 church members working 1 year to lead one person to faith. That's a formula for the demise of the church.
I heard you say that before. Does that say more about the church members or more about the people they're trying to win?
It says that I think both. I think we live in an increasingly resistant culture, an even hostile culture toward Christianity. But, our church is really preparing people how to engage. That's why, given the rest of my life, we started a ministry at Colorado Christian University to train people how to share and defend their faith with online courses and accredited programs to do that, because I want to see churches come alive in terms of reaching their community for Christ. But the problem is, too many churches have been infiltrated by worldly ideas instead of infiltrating the communities for the gospel. So we got some problems, but there's some good signs too. In my church in Houston, where I volunteer as a member and speak as a teaching pastor, we've had 1,103 people come to faith just in the last first 7 months of the year. My friend Shane Pruitt, do you know Shane Pruitt? He's a Southern Baptist evangelist who goes around and preaches to young people. And he said, it used to be if 10% of an audience of young people responded to the gospel affirmatively, we would think this is a big move of God. Today, it's 20%, it's 30%, it's 40%. He's seen 35,000 young people come to faith so far this year. 35,000. And the reason he says is they realize our world is broken. The Bible is right. Our world is broken, but it needs an answer, and the answer is Jesus. So I see some good signs, and what you guys are doing in your ministries, and there's so many other people doing good stuff that, frankly, I've read the end of the book, and God wins, so I'm not...
that question, or that statement about, what young people are seeing,
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing, is we're not doing this in a vacuum. We're doing this where people are seeing that, okay, rejecting truth doesn't have great consequences
Right.
either. This is a great question, Brett, for you. How do you help someone overcome their perceptions if they're wrong when they're so committed to them? There is this kind of Romans 1 rejection of common sense, observable reality that we see, and people can be more committed to perception than reality.
Yeah, that's what Paul says in Romans 1, right? That we suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And so sometimes suppressing the truth is not merely just something that's intellectual. What's driving it is actually immorality. And that's a difficult, I think, place for someone to be at. And sometimes, I think there's some things you can do. Number one, you can warn the person in love. Let them know that you love them, but here's what you see. Your perceptions are off. And there are going to be consequences to this. There's going to be harm that's going to come into your life. And you can warn them in a loving way. Just if I saw someone, a friend drive by and I realize they're driving towards a bridge that's out, I'm going to do everything I can to warn them. And we'd say that would be a loving thing to do, to warn people of the consequences. And it wouldn't matter. It's not, and our faithfulness is what matters, and that not their positive response to it, right? And so we've got to be faithful in that. But then sometimes, and this is where I think Christians, we have an ally. The ally is reality, right? And sometimes what you have to do, and this is maybe more painful, especially when it comes to loved ones, but sometimes you have to wait for reality to take its toll. And see, the universe that God has created is a moral universe. Morality is built into the system. Morality is some of the furniture of the universe. And so we can count on that. So that when you don't function as you were designed to function, you're going to break down, right? And so, I have an appliance at home. It's called a washing machine. Have you seen what that thing does? It's amazing. You put in a bunch of clothes, you put in detergent, push a couple buttons, out come clean clothes. Now imagine if I go into my garage and I say, gosh, I got all these dirty tools now. I got an idea. Let's put them in the washing machine. What's going to happen? That machine's going to break down. It may not break down the first time or the second time, but eventually it's going to break down if it's functioning in a way it wasn't designed to function. In the same way, human beings designed by God, when they live in sin, are not functioning the way that God intended for them, and so they're not going to flourish. And so sometimes you sit back and you have to wait for reality to take its toll, and that can be painful. But as you love people faithfully, they know that you're there to pick them up when they fall down. And then, of course, all of this is, this is sometimes maybe we think it's cliche. It's not cliche. Pray. Pray. God is a God who answers prayer. Be faithful in prayer day in and day out for those folks.
Yeah. It's interesting that Jesus' prayers for lost people continued right up until his final gasp on the cross. Mm-hmm. That when you read the New Testament account of the crucifixion, the original Greek, one of the things you notice is the imperfect tense of the Greek suggests that he didn't just say it once. He kept praying it all through the torture of the crucifixion. While the nails were being driven through his hands, while the nails were being driven through his feet, he kept repeating, Father, forgive them, Father, forgive them, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. And you're exactly right. We got to pray for our loved ones, for our neighbors, for our colleagues, for people at school that we go to school with, whatever, and lift them up to the throne of grace and not give up on them.
I recently talked to a woman who told me that she had an 80-year-old father. She had prayed for him for 30 years. And he had just recently come to Christ after 30 years of prayer. And I just was humbled by that and encouraged, don't give up in prayer.
Right after I came to faith, I told Leslie, her dad was an atheist. And I told Leslie, now that I'm a Christian, let's go tell Al about Jesus. This is going to be awesome. And I go in and I say, Al, guess what? I've come to faith in Jesus, blah, blah, blah. And he looked at me and said, well, that's good for you, but never mention Jesus to me again. Okay, right. So the next day, Leslie said to me, have you prayed for Al today? I said, well, I tried that. No, we got it. What else are we going to do? We prayed for 20 years for Al. And in the last conversation before he died, last cogent conversation of his life, after 87 years as an atheist, he gave his life to Christ. Wow. So we'll spend eternity with him in heaven. But, I wanted to give up 1,000 times because we tried the prayer thing. You know what? What else are you going to do, right?
Yeah.
This conversation, a lot of questions coming in. And by the way, Erin, Brett's wife, if you're watching, I want you to confirm in the comments that Brett learned that lesson about tools by experience. I really suspect that he did. Lee, the evidence for the resurrection is so compelling. Yeah. It's really unbelievable. There's still skeptics in that, and I want to get to that part of this too, that sometimes truth can be so obvious and it's a question of the will, not a question of the evidence anymore. But there are skeptical responses. For example, this came through, some say that Jesus' tomb was empty because the bodies of crucifixion victims were thrown to the dogs and not buried. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I've heard atheists and skeptics raise that question. There's a problem with that idea that Jesus was never buried in the first place. That's why the tomb is empty. His body was thrown to the dogs. And the problem with that is called archaeology, because they have discovered the buried remains of crucifixion victims. In fact, one of them from the first century still had the spike driven through his ankle bone and a piece of the olive wood of the cross still attached. So we know that some crucifixion victims were indeed buried. And if you study Roman custom and law from the first century era, it does provide for, in certain circumstances, for the burial of execution victims. So I think it's reasonable to believe that he was indeed buried.
Yeah. Another historical fact, and this is somewhat related, but we often hear, all of the disciples died horrible deaths because they really believed this. Right. But there are, questions about that in scholarship. Right. Did all the disciples, other than Judas, obviously, obviously he died immediately, but not a martyr's death. Yeah. Does it say this in the Bible? Where do those sources come from?
I don't ever say the disciples died for their conviction that Jesus rose from the dead, because in some of these cases, and Dr. Sean McDowell, Josh McDowell's son, did his doctoral dissertation on this very issue and wrote a book on it. And you see that in some cases, the evidence gets a little bit lost in history. The way I say it is, which is historically well supported, which is they were willing to die. Their willingness to die is established by 7 ancient sources, 6 of them outside the Bible. And that's what's important. I used to think, well, so what if they were willing to die? Terrorists these days are willing to die. They'll strap on a suicide vest and blow themselves up. They're willing to die. So doesn't that mean that their faith is true? I said, no, there's a difference. The difference is that guy today who straps on a suicide vest and goes in a crowded marketplace and blows himself up in a bunch of people, he sincerely believes that if he dies that way, he's going to paradise. Does he know for a fact that it's true? No, he can't know for a fact. He just believes it, and having faith in it, he's willing to die. That tells me nothing about the ultimate truth of his claim. The disciples, in contrast, of all people who've ever lived, were there. They knew if it was true or a lie. They touched the resurrected Jesus, they talked to him, they ate with him. They knew the truth, and knowing the truth, they were willing to die for it. That does tell me something about the veracity of their claims.
Let me jump in here. I think one thing that we need to do as Christians as well is give these well-reasoned arguments, but we also need to realize that we can ask the skeptic questions as well and say, okay, if you don't buy the bodily resurrection of Jesus, okay, give me another plausible explanation.
Yeah.
And so, and wait and see, do they have any other possibilities? And so the skeptic might say, well, okay, mass hallucinations. Disciples believe this, but it was a mass hallucination. And then we know, okay, we have a claim, all right, is it plausible, is it reasonable, what's the evidence for it? And when we study hallucination, we realize hallucination is not something that we do in mass. Hallucination is a first-person private experience. It's much like a dream. Imagine if you walked into this room tonight and you came up to me and you said, Brett, that was an amazing dream we had last night, isn't it? I'd walk away from you. I'd be like, okay, get away from me, weirdo, right? Because I know that dreams are first-person private experiences. In the same way, that's what hallucinations are. And so this is not a plausible explanation. And we can force the skeptic to also give their explanations for these things if they're not going to buy the resurrection.
I have to push back on that mass hallucination theory just because I lived in Jamaica for a year and did some mission work, and marijuana is a big part of the Rastafarian religion, even though it's still illegal. So sometimes they would grow the marijuana among the sugarcane fields, and if the cops found them, they would just burn the whole fields down. And so I think that led to some mass hallucinations. But
they didn't have the same hallucination.
It didn't have the same one. No,
That's right.
that's actually a good point. So they were together apart. And by the way, really important here, just breaking news, Aaron Kunkle did just text me and say, I can confirm Brett does not know how to use our washing machine. So that came through just now. And so great to have that question settled, because we were all wondering.
I was wondering about
and
that.
we were all more skeptical than about Santa.
One time I accidentally said, I didn't say you put detergent in the wash. I said you put deodorant in the washing machine, and that outed me.
That was all there is. I want to lead into a question here that I just love, because I was so struck with Lee at the story of your daughter.
Who is here, by the way? She's up here, and with my wife Leslie. They both came.
She's waving. How old was she when she decided to come to Christ?
5 years old. Yeah.
And you had gone on this 2-year journey
Right.
of checking sources.
Yeah.
She had gone on a 5-year journey, but really a 5-month journey of seeing the pivot and saying,
Exactly.
okay, this is now trustworthy.
Yeah.
The question that came in, and I guess I was struck there by that there is some lies in our culture that we have to talk our kids into. We have to talk our kids out of certain obvious common sense things. I think it's child abuse.
Yeah.
But we live in that sort of culture that attacks our kids at very young ages with lies. And so the question is, and Brett, maybe I'll start with you and then let Lee address it as well. The question came in this way, and I want to reframe it just a bit. How young should we engage our kids on these ideas about truth? And so why don't you deal with the truth thing in general? And Lee, if you would follow up with how young can kids deal with the truth claims of Christianity and start to have some evidence and kind of deal with that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Brett, you wanna start?
I think we start as early as they can speak. I think the earlier we start, the better. And it's just, and all we have to do is really narrate for our kids what's going on around them. This is actually how everyone lives. How do I know that people hold to a correspondence view of truth? Well, because they look both ways before they cross the street, right? What are you trying to do here? And in fact, it's pretty fascinating. You watch a young child. What are they trying to do? They're trying to take their kind of ideas about the world and match it up with reality all of the time. And so this is just what we are created with. This is kind of built in. And the Scripture doesn't lay out some careful view of truth. It just assumes this view. And you look at the word aletheia in the Greek, which is a New Testament word for truth, and it means conformed to reality. That's what it's communicating there. And so I think we narrate for our kids, hey, why did you look both ways before you crossed the street? Or why did you go into the pantry to get cereal? Right? And narrate for them their truth-seeking. Well, you had a belief. You had a belief that the Lucky Charms was in that pantry. And when you went to the pantry, what happened? The Lucky Charms was actually there. So what does that tell you? When your idea, your belief matches up with the way the world really is, it's true. And you get Lucky Charms, right? There's benefit there.
And Aaron, could you confirm that really
no, please.
It's Brett going into the pantry for Lucky Charms. We know that this is the way it is. But carry on, please.
So don't throw me like that. No. Not everything my wife says corresponds to reality. So I just want to be clear here. And so you narrate just the nature of what's going on around us. And of course, you're going to get to more serious issues. And you're going to want to lay out, deeper moral issues as they get older and as they can handle those kinds of things. But you can lay good foundation for them. And then I think also just modeling for them. Modeling that when we live the truth, when we live out God's truth, and particularly the truth of his moral laws, it leads to flourishing, right? It leads to human flourishing. And hopefully we can be models of that for the next generation. So especially a generation that's growing up with so much brokenness. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that brokenness just creates so much noise in their head that they can't hear any of our logical arguments. And so what they need to see is they need to see that those arguments lived out. They need to see that truth lived out, embodied in a life that's experiencing true goodness.
I know you and I have talked about this as having young kids. In a culture that presents lies as truth without arguments, through images, through television programs, we can't let those lies go unchecked. Because I did not plan to sit my 3 kids down. At the time, I had 3, when the Supreme Court made a decision redefining marriage, and have a conversation about that with my kids who were 10, 8, and 6 at the time. But I think it was N.T. Wright who said, Christians don't always get to choose what they think about in this world. And we have to be willing to call lies for what they are so that they don't just believe everything that comes at face value and is normalized. Yeah. Lee?
Yeah, in terms of evidence and so forth, I think, again, the younger the better. It has to be age appropriate. But, I've done a series of books called The Case for Christ, The Case for Heaven, The Case for Miracles, The Case for Faith, The Case for various things. And we then created student editions for high school kids, but then children's editions for younger kids. And my daughter, Allison, she married a guy with a master's degree in apologetics, and they together wrote a book for toddlers that parents would read to their toddler. It was called That's Where God Is. And in this book, I'm actually a character in the book, in the drawings, except I'm bald in this thing. I don't know how did that happen? Anyway. But the point of the book was this little kid is talking to his grandpa and says, where do you see God? How do you know if there's a God? And the grandpa says, why don't you look for him this week? And then the book takes you through a series of experiences that little kid has. He walks through life and he sees the evidence for creation and how it points toward God. And it's a book designed for parents to read to a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, basic concepts. But we can begin to unfold that. One of the things that I'm working on with my daughter, she happens to be a leading expert on homeschooling. And we're creating a homeschooling curriculum starting in kindergarten all the way to 12th grade on evidence for the faith, age appropriate all along the way. And we want to use it for Sunday schools and for Christian schools as well. Because our kids are going to be challenged in their faith at a younger and younger age. There was a guy I was communicating with online. His granddaughter is a kindergartner in a public school. She was on the playground during recess, and the other kids were taunting her and making fun of her because they said, oh, you believe in God. You still believe in fairy tales, because she believes in God. our kids are going to get challenged at a younger and younger age. We need to prepare them and help them see that not just stories from the Bible, but why we can trust the Bible, why we can trust God, evidence for the reality of God and the truth of the Christian worldview.
What's the title of the book for toddlers that you're
It's called That's Where God Is.
That's Where God Is?
Yeah.
Are you sure that character didn't have a bow tie? Because it may be.
You may have mixed us
It
up.
may
a bit.
be that Bob was the grandfather in that. I'm just saying, maybe.
Could be.
So it's deductive reasoning, looking at the evidence. That's,
I just want to give one piece of advice on this, really practical, because in a skeptical culture, our kids they're going to come to us with questions.
Yeah.
And one thing that we must never do is shut down their questions.
Yeah.
Because what you'll find is that they don't stop asking the questions. They'll just stop asking you those questions. And they'll go find another source. They'll go to social media, they'll go to their friends, they'll Google it, and then you will become a source that they do not trust.
Right.
I want my kids to come to me with every single question they have, and if I can't answer it, I need the humility to say, I don't know.
But let's find an answer together.
There's ellipses after that. I don't know. But that's a really good question. And we're going to do some research together.
Yeah, that's
so
awesome.
One of the things I want to, as we just probably just have time for one more question, and Chuck Colson used to quote, I think it was Pope John Paul referred to this age as the dictatorship of relativism. And the alternative to a correspondence vision of truth is a relativistic view of truth, which basically says truth is up to the beholder, and it doesn't matter if it corresponds with the world, it only matters that it corresponds with the viewer or the beholder of the world. And it's interesting how that language, that relativism, which kind of comes under the guise of tolerance and you be you, you believe you, can become so tyrannical. Can become so dictatorial. And aren't we there? Like, there are some beliefs, you're not allowed to have that belief,
right,
or you're off the playground, and we're not talking about kindergartners anymore. Right. So how do we respond to a relativism that claims to be a relativism but is really dictatorial?
That's a good question. I think it's going to require different responses in different contexts. I think sometimes there's just times where you just have to stand firm. You know, sometimes you just have to say, this is the line, and I'm going to stand firm. And no matter what the say that for me, please? Dictatorial.
You're welcome.
Consequences. No matter what those consequences are, because, and this is one thing that we have to count the costs on. What are going to be the social costs of standing for the truth? And what you're going to see, I mean, you will see this inconsistency where there's a claim that, relativistic claims, and yet then when you don't go along with some of these claims, then there's immediate consequences, or there's social shame, or there's, whatever. You're saying, well, how does that work? Well, it turns out the whole conversation on tolerance seems to have gone away a little bit. It used to be that, oh, well, you guys need to be tolerant, and we found out, well, tolerance was really a one-way street. But I'm not even hearing much conversation about tolerance anymore, which is ironic, because this used for a relativist, this was kind of the highest virtue, right? Everyone's got their own truth, so let's tolerate everyone's views. You're not hearing that anymore. The culture is becoming more aggressive and more hostile, and it's, hey, there's no such thing as tolerance anymore. Because think about it, tolerance assumes disagreement. You're not allowed to disagree anymore on certain issues.
Right.
And so you just see, I mean, it's hard to even make sense of, right? I mean, relativism on one hand, and yet conformity on the other hand. And so it is a very chaotic thing, and it's difficult to navigate. Sometimes you got to stand firm. Sometimes you got to be very gracious in it.
I love the Alexander Solzhenitsyn line, just don't say what's not true. Just make a commitment right there. Yeah. And by the way, Aaron says, I can confirm. Hold on, this is important. I can confirm that Brett's statement, not everything my wife says matches with reality, is obviously false. So we're glad we got that out. Lee, we got just enough time for you to speak into that last question, and we'll give you the final word.
I think Brett said it well. I mean, I think sometimes when you're with a friend and there's that insistence on a relativistic viewpoint and so forth, even though you tried to point out what you so masterfully pointed out and what you so masterfully pointed out, that it is unlivable and it is contradictory to say that there is no absolute truth is to make an absolute truth statement. It's self-refuting. It just makes no sense. But sometimes we got to dig deep and get to the real issue of why that person is pushing God away. And, I used to ask people to get into a spiritual conversation, I used to ask them the question, if you could ask God any one question and you knew he'd give you an answer right now, what would you ask him? And then they would say, well, I think I'd ask him, why does a loving God allow pain and suffering? And I used to say, oh, let me preach you a 5-point sermon on why God allows pain and suffering. I don't do that anymore. Now I say, wow, of all the questions in the universe, why did you ask that one? And then they say, because my wife has just been diagnosed with cervical cancer. Where's God in that? Or we lost a child in childbirth 5 years ago. Where was God when that happened? Yeah. And what they need is not a 5-point sermon on why God allows pain and suffering. They need someone to put their arm around their shoulder and weep with them and encourage them and be Jesus to them. So, sometimes you're right, we got to stand firm. Sometimes we got to try to get behind what's really motivating people to put God at arm's length. And sometimes the best thing we can do is just be Jesus to them.
Lee, give everyone the website where they can follow you.
Yeah, strobelcenter.com.
Strobelcenter.com. Brett's T-shirt says Maven. People were texting in. What's the T-shirt say? Give them your website for Maven.
It's maventruth.com.
All right, and our website at the Colson Center is colsoncenter.org. And if you want to check out the program in particular that led to this annual symposium that Bob mentioned earlier, it's something that Chuck Colson founded called the Colson Fellows Program. Paul says, entrust what you know to faithful men who will entrust it to faithful men. And in other words, this is a reproductive thing. The Colson Fellows is how we carry on that legacy of Chuck Colson, and this idea of creating platforms for these sorts of conversations is a real product of that training, and you can find out more at colsonfellows.org. Would you thank Brett and would you thank Lee for their contributions tonight? There you go.
So before we have a closing song, a couple of things. We have gift bags. Some of you already have them. Some of them are probably still out front. Through generous donors, everybody's going out of here with books. John and Brett co-authored a book that we used in the Colson Fellows about culture. And Lee's most famous book, The Case for Christ, is in your bag. And Lee and I have been negotiating. I've agreed to release The Case for Truth if he would write a book, right? One more thing, two more things. This Sunday morning in this room, we have a little thing called Bay Harbor Church, and every week we have a different visiting pastor. Guess who's teaching this Sunday? Lee Strobel. So we invite you, your friends, anybody to be back here at 10:30 Sunday. Come as you are. No bow ties allowed, okay? And if you really want to hear Lee and his ministry partner again, which is Mark Middleberg, Mark is here tonight, they will be teaching in Traverse City at Harvest Bible Chapel Saturday morning at 10 o'clock, 10 to 12. Everything's free. We welcome you at all of them. Thank you for being here tonight. And I want to welcome McKenna and Sam Schubkegel back for our closing song. Thank you so much.
Scared. Oh, I thought I knew scared, but I'm so filled with fear, I can barely move. Doubt, I've had my share of doubt, but never more than right now. I'm wondering, where are you? Here on the edge of fall apart. Somehow your promises find my troubled This is the truth I'm standing on. Even when all my strength is gone, you are faithful forever. I know you'll never let me fall. Oh, right now I'm choosing to believe. Someday soon I'll look back and see all the pain had a purpose. Your plan was perfect all along. This is the truth I'm standing on. Good, I believe you're still good. Even when life's not good, I will not lose this hope that the God who parts the sea promises He's gonna make a way for me. This is the truth I'm standing on. Even when all my strength is gone, you are faithful forever. I know you'll never let me fall. Right now I'm choosing to believe. Someday soon I'll look back and see all the pain had a purpose. Your plan was perfect all along. This is the truth I'm standing on. My rock, my shield, my firm foundation. I know I will not be shaken. You remind me where my help comes from. This is the truth I'm standing on. Even when all my strength is gone, you are faithful forever. I know you'll never let me fall. Right now I'm choosing to believe. Someday soon I'll look back and see all the pain had a purpose. Your plan was perfect all along. This is the truth I'm standing on.
Thank you so much for being here. Have a good night.